Now, let me try to go through a number of issues. I think what we have here is a very, very important issue. We have generally been told not to discuss this issue because it's settled and so on and so forth. As many of you know, in fact, the TPP, as it is often referred to abroad, and the TPPA, as it is referred to in this country, has become a very, very contentious issue. And almost every serious presidential candidate as of 3 months ago was against the TPP. And this was after it was signed. The people were against it for all kinds of different reasons, and I don't necessarily agree with everybody's motives for disagreeing with it, but it is probably the one unifying factor. Nonetheless, I believe that corporate interests will successfully lobby for it to be passed, probably during the lame duck session after the next president of the United States is elected and before the new president is inaugurated. So in a way, our goose is cooked. But let me try to explain to you what it is about the goose which is worth cooking. And I think it's very important also to remember that many of the people who have made public statements one way or the other are often not necessarily very accurately quoted, because people's positions are actually quite nuanced, and they are often quoted out of context. Let me try to go through three areas which are, I think, of importance to you, and particularly because of Wawasan's Open University's commitment to policy dialogue, I think it is relevant to the nation. So these issues will basically be trade issues, and I will quickly tell you why I believe that they are much more problematic than just the issues which have just been mentioned. A second set of issues which I will just mention by way of passing, but I would remind you that Professor Salim Rashid from University Utara is giving a lecture at Bank Negara this coming week, which I will not be attending, but where he will express some of his concerns about its impact on the financial sector. And related to that, of course, are some of my concerns as it relates to intellectual property rights. And the third set of issues is basically about the what is called ISDS. Something which probably most of you have not heard about, the investor-state dispute settlement arrangements, provisions in the TPP. And it's particularly appropriate that Tun is here because it really, in my view, represents a huge slap in the face for all the judiciaries involved, what the ISDS provisions are. So it is very, very serious. Now let me begin first with how unfortunately, government officials have been involved in misrepresenting basic facts. This is a slide which was taken, which was published by the Wall Street Journal at the beginning of February, and basically is a slide taken from the USTR website. USTR is the United States Trade Representative. It's basically the chief negotiator of the United States, and the USTR basically presents this to show how much growth will take place due to the growth of trade associated with the TPP. So according to them, there will be that kind of expansion, and this is how they represent it. Okay, and the Wall Street Journal, which is, by the way, a very conservative journal, probably closer to Wan Saiful's heart than mine, actually represents it this way. So just contrast this. This is how they represent it, and this is how it should be accurately represented. Look at the contrast. Okay, and in fact, the growth in trade is actually quite small. But let us remember that this doesn't mean a growth of exports. It means a growth of exports as well as imports, because the methodology they use basically assumes that the trade balance remains unchanged. So for every little increase in exports, there will be a corresponding increase in imports, which is the second lie which the USTR has. Okay, so you have a huge representation of export growth But in fact, the trade balance remains unchanged. So you can easily present this same thing as this is a huge increase in import growth. Okay, it depends on how it is basically whether you want to describe a glass as half full or half empty. Okay, so it's very important to put this in perspective, and this is how it should be presented. And so you do have some increase in trade, but in fact, it is not an increase in exports alone, but also an increase in imports. This is what the methodology implies. So, as a former British Prime Minister used to say, there are statistics, and damn lies. Okay, and this is basically what we are up against. So let me quickly run through what what my general objections are. As I said, basically this whole negotiations over the TPP involve very, very powerful lobbies. So my old friend Mike Froman, who was the USTR, he was the Sherpa when I was representing the United Nations. He was the one representing President Obama. And so we had quite a number of dealings with one another. And basically, in the position of USTR, he had about 700 official advisors. Okay, 700 official advisors, almost 600 of whom were basically from corporations, private corporations. So you can be sure that when he steps down as USTR in January next year, his future is assured. He becomes a senior partner in a firm, and every corporation, or almost every corporation whom he has been working with, will probably flock to him for representation on these kinds of issues, because he will be considered to be the leading authority. This is the way it works. Okay, this is the way it works. It's not considered corruption. It's not considered illegal, but this is the way the business works in the US, and this is what it means. Why it is so important for people to aspire to public office, because of the possibility of personal remuneration and income flows subsequently. Now, I think it's also important for us to remember that for countries to develop, it is important that you have what we call policy space. Now, policy space, to be fair, can be abused. But if you don't have any policy space, you are not able to change the circumstances which you inherit, and you are not able to improve your conditions. So this is why we consider this very important. And you can, if you will, if you're not sure, you can often inherit a situation and you can negotiate a deal which seems very logical at the moment you negotiate the deal. But circumstances may change and you might get stuck with the situation. So let me describe very, very quickly the situation in the second half of the 20th century. As many of you who take a longer view of these things knows, food prices fell during the second half of the 20th century. Thanks to a number of factors. In Kedah, for example, and Perlis, there was the Green Revolution. The Muda irrigation scheme made double cropping possible, and theoretically 5 crops in 2 years. And in some parts of our country now, you have Skinchan, for example, where you have even triple cropping. All this has been made possible by the introduction of high-yielding varieties which grew much faster, and the possibility of irrigation, the introduction of mechanization of both plowing as well as harvesting. So there was a time, for example, by the 1980s, when you had John Deere tractors doing a lot of the plowing. And many of these tractors were owned by companies in Kuala Lumpur, such as the Globe Silk Store, curiously enough, was one of the major owners of such companies. So you had this huge increase in food production, and the nature, because food producers were often small farmers, they could not collude, and so their bargaining power was often quite weak. So even though you had huge increases in productivity and production and income, huge increase in productivity and output, it didn't necessarily mean that farmers were significantly better off. And the main reason for this, of course, is that you do not have the power to raise prices in that kind of a situation. Now, in Malaysia, there were some exceptions because of the importance of the rice self-sufficiency policy and so on and so forth. But by and large, in most of the world, small individual farmers were not able to influence policy very much. So the result was that the increases in productivity were enjoyed by consumers in the form of lower food prices. So in the second half of the 20th century, food prices actually went down in most of the world. But what has happened since? From around the middle of the last decade, many things happened. It's a long story. I don't want to get into it right now. But most importantly, for our purposes, it basically caused the price of food to go up, particularly cereal foods. And most of the time, whatever you might think about it, whether you're hungry or not, depends on how much carbohydrate you eat. So whether it's rice or wheat or maize, that is essentially crucial. So the result was that food prices have begun to go up again since the middle of the last decade. You can blame it on biofuels, you can blame it on financial speculation, whatever your case might be. There are many factors involved, and it's not a single factor issue, but all this happened. Now, it is very important, therefore, to recognize that as far as the agreement on agriculture, which was struck, at the end of the 20th century, was good for the preceding 4 decades. But now that food prices are going up again, it is no longer convenient. So when the Indian government, for example, passed a Food Security Act to try to ensure that nobody in India goes hungry, it was no longer possible for them to implement that act, to enforce that act without contravening the agreement on agriculture. This was the essence of the problem, and why India has been leading the fight against the WTO. Now, let me quickly go through some of the trade issues, because they're not easy to try to discuss, to review very quickly. But I think it's important for us to recognize that by and large, whatever benefits you hear about, I'm not in the business of denying that there will be some benefits for some people, but I think it is very important to recognize that there are also major costs and risks. And what we find in this country is almost no discussion of the costs and risks, which is why I'm very concerned. Now, let me first tell you that there's only one US government study which has ever been done on the trade effects from the TPP. And guess what? They find that after 10 years after the TPP is first implemented, in all the TPP countries, there will be total growth of 0.1%. 0.1 after 10 years, okay? So if you do if your arithmetic is good, you can do it, you can calculate compound interest, otherwise you do simple interest, and it's 0.01% per annum. Okay? This is the total growth. No big deal, really. I mean, if that is what we are going to have a TPP about, really, it's not worth it. I mean, it's such a big fuss, you don't need 6,350 pages to get that effect. Okay? And that's all it promises. Now, this study is by the US Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service, which is the only service of that type within the US government. It is the only US government study. Okay? It's not my study, it's not anybody else's study. So, but what happens? We find that they had to create more growth. Otherwise, nobody would buy the TPP. Okay? So, and this, by the way, was done on the basis of some optimistic projections which are no longer valid, because the final TPPA, which was signed in February and previously negotiated in October last year, there were many things they couldn't agree on. So it's even less than what the US government estimated. Okay? So what we have found now is that they have found ways of doing it by presenting a lot of benefits and underestimating a lot of costs. Okay, and now these are some of the details which I don't want to bother you with right now, but I want to get into some of the quick details and why it is very important for us to be very careful about it. So particularly I want to warn you about the tricks. Okay, right? I began with two tricks. How the figures were being presented by the official US trade representative. Okay, but let me get into some of the more detailed elements of the tricks. And most of their growth comes from something called the NTMs, non-trade measures. Okay, and they say that the non-trade measures are going to give you out of the. So they've come up with new projections. Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned it earlier. So there's a group called the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Okay, Peter Peterson is a man who's made a lot of money, and he endowed the Institute for International Economics with a lot of money, and so now the institute is named after him, the Peterson Institute. So they have made up much more growth. Okay, how do they get the growth? From so-called non-trade measures. Okay, so remember, they themselves are saying that this is more than a trade agreement. Much, much more than a trade agreement. So let us not delude ourselves that this is basically a trade agreement. This is much more than a trade agreement. Much, much more. And 84%, 84 point something percent of the growth is supposed to come, is not trade related. Okay? And they do it, and I don't want to get through the details, and I'll be happy to show you the details for those of you who are interested. And basically, they came up with 84%. So 84% is due to non-trade measures, some of which I will try to discuss with you later. Okay? So it comes from things like strengthening intellectual property rights. It comes from the investor state dispute settlement scheme. It comes from assumptions about financial liberalization and so on and so forth. Okay, that's where the bulk of the growth is supposed to come from. Okay, it's still dubious, but let's move on. Yeah. So basically, they now claim that they can get not 0.1, which the US government found, but 1.1. Okay, it's more than 10 times as much. Okay, it's more than 10 times as much. How do they do that? By bringing in the NTMs. Okay, this is what they do. Okay, so if you average it out, instead of the 0.01, they are claiming 0.06. Okay, because they are saying that you will get 1.1 not after 10 years but after 15 years. So if you do the arithmetic, you will get 0.06. Okay, an increase by more than 5-fold. Not bad. Okay. Okay. So just watch the tricks. Okay. So how do they do this? They do this in very curious ways. Okay. Now most of you have probably, thankfully, never studied much economics. Okay, but in economics, there is something called deadweight gains. Okay, there is a deadweight gain because you don't have enough specialization, you don't have enough division of labor. So when you have that improved specialization, okay, then you're supposed to get rid of some of the dead weight. Okay, so that dead weight gain is a one-time gain. Okay, it's a one-time gain. It is not cumulative. Okay, so when you add a dead weight gain, you don't make it cumulative. Okay, it just means your starting point is higher, but you cannot say that the growth rate is faster. You follow what I'm saying? You cannot, that's not what you're supposed to do, but that's one of the tricks they do. Okay, they do a number of other things, but to get into all the details is too, it will take too long. Okay, so let me move on. And so why are these people irritated with us? Okay, so when I was in New York, I was in New York as the Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development. Basically, it's a fancy title for saying the Chief Economist of the UN. And while I was there, I basically started something called a global policy model. Okay, what is the significance of a global policy model? Maybe our moderator might not like it, but basically it's a Keynesian model. Okay, it's a Keynesian model. Now, Keynes, for all those of you who are older, Keynes was the big name in economics. But for those of you who are younger, nobody here has heard of Keynes. Okay, but basically, after the crisis of 2008, the world began to look at Keynes again. They realized that, they've been sold a bill of goods, as the Americans say, and they began to look at Keynes again. And so we developed a Keynesian model. I sort of introduced it around 2000. I joined the UN in 2005. I think I started it around 2006, 2007. UN is very slow. And finally, it got picked up. And then, unfortunately, the colleague who were in charge, one went off to Geneva. And then he finally managed to recruit another person who also happens to be in Geneva, but in a different organization, Dialogue. So these two chaps, Izurieta and Capaldo, basically did this work. But because they are working in the UN system, they have a gag order. Okay, so they couldn't say anything. So they asked me to speak for them. Okay, so I want to tell you that I didn't do the heavy lifting. The real work was done by them. Okay, I'm just the mouthpiece, if you will. Okay, but I cannot just be the mouthpiece. I better understand what was going on. So I really did some homework to basically understand what my friends did. So basically what we did was we say that, okay, we take the Peterson Institute numbers and then we calculate the growth effects using a Keynesian model. Okay, so we accept that there will be trade growth as the Peterson Institute claims. Yeah, which, as I said earlier, even the US government study does not claim that much growth, right? But I don't dispute them on that. And basically what we did, we used more realistic assumptions and we showed that there will be job losses. Okay? There will be a downward pressure on wages. And as a result of that, some growth in inequality. And that upset a lot of people. Now the three of us, Izurieta, Capaldo and I, all three of us are non-Americans. So when we saw what was happening in the US, I was supposed to go to the US Congress to testify in February. At the last minute, I said no, because I don't want the foreigner issue to become an issue. Okay, so you have to be very sensitive to these kinds of things, especially with Trump and his comments about, well, he's commented on so many things. I don't want to go through the list. Okay, so I basically stayed out of the American debate, but nonetheless, the Peterson Institute people started going for us, and they started attacking us for all kinds of things. Not realizing or not even looking carefully at what we did and not acknowledging that we were actually starting off with their numbers. Okay? We took their trade numbers. We never claimed that we can estimate how much trade increase there will be. We accepted their numbers and we worked through the numbers to try to look at the growth. And this is basically what we did. And we saw that some countries might actually experience an income loss. Now, at that time, when they started hammering us, it was very controversial. In the last few weeks, we are now what we are saying is now considered almost mainstream. A professor at MIT, David Autor, has basically come to similar conclusions on the basis of the US-China relationship, trade relationship, and the US-Korean relationship. So what we're saying now is uncontroversial, and he has actually showed that how the trade has affected different parts of the US and how job losses have affected political sentiments. So now almost all the politicians are keeping quiet about it precisely because they realize how risky it is either for themselves or for their parties to say too much about this. So in a way, I'm trying to say to you that we have become almost mainstream now in the debate within the US. And part of the reason, of course, is that there's an election going on, so people are much more open to changing their views on many things. And so what I think, what we basically showed, as I mentioned earlier, is that it affects labor, it affects employment. We are not saying that it affects all countries equally. In Malaysia, for example, official unemployment is less than 4%. 4% in most countries is considered to be full employment. So it's no big deal as far as Malaysia is concerned. Okay? I'm not saying that Malaysia will be much worse off, but for the other members, it is a big deal. But in terms of the benefits for Malaysia, again, I will try to show you in a little while that you will have different consequences. So I'm just flashing through these slides because it will take me too long to get into the details, but I'll be very happy to discuss them if you have an interest. Let me focus on what PricewaterhouseCoopers presents as the great hope for Malaysia. Okay? Now, what is the great hope for Malaysia? Textiles. Okay, what they mean by textiles is actually not textiles, it is garments. Okay, because Malaysia hardly produces any textiles. There's, of course, the well-known Penangite, Mr. Lau Jotek, is that his name? Yeah, better known as Joe Lau. I don't know whether his name is Joe Lau or Joe Lo. Some people insist that it's pronounced Lau, some people insist that it's pronounced Lo. But whatever his name is, his father, of course, was built up this listed company called Malaysian Weaving, and is well known for that. Okay, but other people, of course, know him rather differently. So Joe Lau father made his fortune in that. That is one weaving company, but now the company is actually quite diversified. It's not a yarn weaving company. And then there's another company, I think, which was set up in the old days during the time of the late Lim Swee An. Dr. Lim Swee An, when he was the Minister of Trade and Industry in the 1960s, there was a textiles thing. The late Irene Fernandez, the first time I met her, I think 1974, was in that there was a strike going on in Kamunting Industrial Estate near. So this is basically the main factories which still exist today. I think pretty much all the other textiles. So what they mean is something what they call textiles is actually garments. Okay. Now, two things about this. Number one. When about 30 years ago, I got one of my students to look at garments in those days, and she found that actually there were more than 200,000 people working in garments, most of them women. So it was the single largest employer of women in this country. Okay, more than electronics. Everybody was studying electronics and so on and so forth, but actually garments was much bigger. And then 2014 official numbers. I checked. What do you think the number is? Less than 15,000. Less than 15,000. Okay? So the numbers have dropped drastically. Now, what does the TPP provision? The TPP provides for includes something called the Yarn Forward Rule. What is the Yarn Forward Rule? The Yarn Forward Rule basically means that if you use yarn from within the TPP region, then you qualify for a reduction in tariff. But if you don't use yarn from within from a TPP source, it doesn't qualify. Okay? So where do we get most of our yarn? Okay? A lot of it comes from China. A lot of it comes from Indonesia. Many people don't realize that. A lot of it comes from Korea and Taiwan. Those are the main sources of yarn which is used in Malaysia. Okay? But if you don't use either US or Japanese yarn, you don't qualify. So without reading the details, this consultancy report to the Malaysian government has said, oh, we are going to get a lot of growth from the textiles industry. So unfortunately, whether you like it or not, the devil is in the details, and there is not going to be very much growth coming from textiles. And whatever we might have to offer, you can be sure that Vietnam can underprice us in terms of costs. So I don't see where all this is coming from. Of course, you can have some niche products. You know, I'm not saying there's absolutely nothing. You might have some niche products like something called Uniqlo. Okay, you know, how many of you are going to wear Uniqlo in this country? You might use it to sweat. You know, if you're trying to lose weight, you go and run around and then you put on the Uniqlo and sweat. You know, but otherwise nobody is going to use that type of material. So except for those niche products, there really is no future. Now, so whether you accept the US government study or you accept the TPP study, let us be very clear. If you accept the Peterson Institute study, let us be very clear that the actual growth impact from trade is next to negligible. Okay? It is 0.1% or 0.16% over 15 years. Okay? That's the maximum you will get even with a misreading of the fine print. Okay? So let's not kid ourselves that this is about trade. Okay? It's not essentially a trade agreement. But just in case you're not happy enough with those concerns, as Wan Saiful correctly pointed out, this is basically managed trade agreement. It's not a free trade agreement, but even more importantly, who is it managed for? And I can assure you it is not managed for you or me. Okay? Unless some of you have got very, very powerful interests in, you know. Some people in this country do, but I don't think any of them are coming here to listen to this lecture. So probably present company excluded. Okay? So basically, but also very importantly, what has happened? Okay? So the only serious forum for trade negotiations, if you are serious about free trade, as Wan Saiful is, okay, is something called the World Trade Organization. For all its weaknesses, that is the only show in town. And what did Mike Froman do in the middle of December last year? He went to Nairobi and he basically said to them, close shop. Okay, close shop, call off the Doha development round. Now, many of you are not old enough to remember, but in at the end of the last century, there was something called the Seattle Ministerial Talks for the WTO, at which many countries walked out because they felt that the WTO agreement was very, very seriously flawed and against development. So after 9/11, the Doha round was started with the promise of development. So it wasn't just the Doha round, it was the Doha development round, a promise of development, okay? And basically, Mike Froman goes to Nairobi and says, forget about the Doha round, okay? We have a trade agreement for the 21st century. This is the future, sign on for it, okay? Now, all the issues had already been rejected. Okay, the so-called Singapore issues had already been rejected in Seattle. Now, through the back door, he's trying to push it back on. And last week, it was rejected in Geneva. But basically what has happened is that you have the US being supported by Cecilia Malmström, the EU Trade Commissioner, basically saying that these are the issues we want to be negotiated. So that will be at the end of the Doha round, and possibly it will transform the very nature of the WTO. WTO will not become a forum for negotiation. It will basically kill the WTO itself in terms of realizing any kind of development potential. So, and the possibility of any agreement which will enhance food security, some of the Indian concerns will be dead, and we will see basically some very small benefits at best, but rewriting of the rules of international economics in the interest of large corporations. Those very corporations which will probably sign up Mr. Froman when he goes back to the private sector. Okay? So, and people who are serious about free trade, for example, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, whatever you might think of him, he has basically said, you do not, if you're serious about trade, this is not the way you go. And he objects to it on two grounds. Number one, plurilateralism undermines multilateralism. Okay, and basically the TPP is a plurilateral. Plurilateral means more than one, more than two in this case, but less than the whole. Okay. Now, his second objection is that you do not ruin a trade agreement by adding in all these non-trade issues. And those are his two objections. And on this issue, at least, I think I would certainly very much agree with him. So, let us be very clear about this, that many of the most frustrating issues for developing countries, including Malaysia, are not being addressed by the TPP. Many of the non-trade barriers are not being addressed by the TPP. Very few of them will actually be addressed. Okay? A few concessions here and there, I don't deny. But the main sticking points are not going to be addressed. Okay? Now, so what are these new rules about? Why do we need 6,350 pages? Okay? I doubt anybody in this room, and I will be the first to confess, I have got better things to do in my life than read those 6,350 pages, which I suspect most people, including the most eminent lawyers, will have great difficulty understanding, because it's written in a particular dialect of legal English. Okay? And this is what is involved. So, I think it's very important for us to recognize that these rules are basically being demanded by the large corporations of the world, and these will basically constrain our ability to basically achieve our development aspirations. And most dangerously, they will strengthen investor rights, intellectual property rights, and so on. Let me quickly run through some of the issues. So, intellectual property rights. As I said, it will strengthen intellectual property rights, but the biggest fear I have is with how it will strengthen pharmaceutical companies. And there are three elements which are very important for us to recognize. Number one, what are called the evergreening provisions. In other words, a patent can continue to be extended beyond the normal life of a patent by evergreening it. Okay? You can extend the life of a patent. That basically means that the higher, that monopoly right which comes from the IPR can be extended for a longer period. Secondly, for what are called biologics, likewise. Okay, biologics are basically the new kinds of things which are coming from biological elements. They will now play God and claim property rights over biological things. And thirdly, it constrains the use of formularies. Basically, similar medicines, Okay, similar medicines can also be, in other words, it's very vague. What is considered to be a similar medicine? Okay, so if I don't like what you come up with and I say that yours is basically based on my medicine, even though it's different, I can claim that yours is similar to mine, and therefore I can take a case and block you from selling you. So all this will have the effect of raising the cost of medicines. Now, when I was in New York, one of the things I did was to ask for a study of the cost of medicines in upper middle income countries such as Malaysia. Okay, upper middle income countries, we found that the cost of medicines is on average 6.1 times, not 6.1%, 6.1 times the so-called reference price. Okay? 6.1 times the reference price. This is incredible. You are all paying medicines for very, very high cost for medicines. And today, now, many of us, I included, we are all outraged. Okay, we are all outraged because the US dietary guidelines have just come out a few weeks ago, and they have said that this obsession with cholesterol was wrong. Was wrong. Cholesterol is good for you. Okay, so don't get me wrong. Triglycerides are still, but the cholesterol thing, and that obsession with cholesterol spawned a huge multi-billion-dollar industry in statins. Okay? And even though it's statins and statins are associated with tin, you can be sure that it wasn't from Malaysian tin. Okay? So the statins, we paid through our noses. Many of us paid for years, sometimes decades, paid a lot of money for these statins, which now turn out to be completely unnecessary and probably inflicted damage to our livers. Okay? This is what has basically happened. So there is outrage about this kind of thing. There's outrage about how we can be sold things. We can be misled into thinking that we need those things to improve our lives. So this is the kind of problem which we are facing. Okay, and so what it basically will mean is that higher costs, lower access. Now, the present health minister has bravely told the world and told the Malaysians that it won't affect him. Well, I cannot understand how he's going to ensure that Malaysians get the drugs which they would like to get, which they hope to get at government subsidized prices, especially since the pharmaceutical what does Yap Tonji do? The pharmacological Tan Sri Ko friend in Chicago was one of Malaysia's first pharmacologists, and he basically they produce in Section 13. They used to produce a lot of generic drugs. That has basically now disappeared. Malaysians no longer produce the generic drugs, even though we are capable of producing those generic drugs. And basically, so private companies, typically foreign companies, basically rule the roost. And this is the situation which we find ourselves in. So let me move on very quickly. Investor-state dispute settlement. This is the third area of great concern. I'll run through quite a number of slides. But basically, it will strengthen foreign investor rights. And let me tell you what basically is at issue, okay? Without going through all the slides. Basically, any foreign corporation, a foreign meaning a company which is registered within a TPP country. Okay, a Malaysian company cannot sue the Malaysian government, okay? Okay? So why should it be registered as a Malaysian company? It might make more sense to be registered in Brunei or in Singapore. Okay? But if you're a foreign company, you can sue the Malaysian government. Okay? And you can sue the Malaysian government for anything which you claim basically deprives you of profits which you would otherwise receive. Okay? And how is this to be resolved? Is it going to be resolved by the Malaysian judiciary or by the foreign judiciary? No. It's going to be resolved by private arbitration. Okay? And it's binding because there's no recourse to higher appeal beyond whatever decision is made by the panel of three. So if I'm suing, I get to choose one member of the panel, and I have to agree on a second member of the panel. And how large is this community? Less than 200 lawyers in the world. So in one case, we are sitting in one case. Let us say that Dato' Anwar is a lawyer for one side, and Tan Sri is a lawyer for the other side, and I'm lawyer for the other side, and I'm the third lawyer which both sides agree on. The panel is three. Okay, so the three members of the panel, one is appointed by the person suing, one is appointed by the government defending, and the third member is. So, this is in one case. In another case, you can play musical chairs. We change different positions. One could, instead of representing representing the company, you are representing the government now. Instead of so we can all basically change positions. Okay, so basically, what are the incentives for people in this business? The incentives is to keep the system going because this is how you make your money. Okay, so it's basically a fundamentally corrupt system, in my view, a corrupt system, and it is basically an insult to all the existing judiciaries. Now, you might say, oh, well, this Malaysia has got a Hapa 6 judicial system. Well, even if you believe that, okay, that is not the issue. Because in the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the Americans are asking for exactly the same thing among the Europeans. Okay, from the Europeans. They dare not say that those are Hapa 6 judicial systems. So the issue is to shift, to privatize, basically, the judiciary, because you don't trust national judicial systems. Okay, so you might hear all kinds of arguments about the judiciary, and given my own experiences, I won't be saying that I find that judicial independence is uncompromised, but I think I would trust that system much more than I would trust what is being created now, what is being strengthened now. So this is basically the key issue. I'm not sure what happened to all my words. Oh, okay. Okay, so let me quickly. This is more sophisticated than okay. So basically, these are some of the issues involved with the ISDS. Okay, the wording of many of these documents, despite it being 6,350 pages, is still quite vague. And so there will be a lot of room for interpretation, and you can sue till the cows come home. And you can be sure that a small company from Malaysia is not going to sue the US government, but you can not be sure about the converse. Okay? And you can be sure that, supposing the converse is true, let us say the Malaysian government is unhappy about a foreign corporation. It does not give any rights to the Malaysian government to do anything. Let's take the case of Bhopal in India. 250,000 people died immediately, and many others have had their lives injured by what happened in Bhopal. Okay, many of you who are younger might not remember, but there was a case with Union Carbide. You know how much the Indian government or the Indian who suffered have received to this day? Anybody knows? The huge quantity which they have received? Well, it's a trick question. The answer is zero. Okay? The answer is zero. Nothing. Okay? So, and this is supposed to be in the interest of justice. Okay? So, let us be quite clear about what is involved. Now, I'm just running through this so that we have more time to discuss, but let me, okay, what I want to show in the next few slides is just basically that this business, I call it the business, okay, this business of ISDS is a very recent business. You will see that most of the investor claims have only grown in the last decade and a half. Okay? Very, very recent. And the compensation levels have grown. You will see almost exponentially. Okay? Ecuador, for example, stopped American oil company from drilling in a national park. 2 billion compensation. They have paid 1 billion already, they still cannot afford to pay the second billion. Okay? This is not a trivial matter. This is not a trivial matter. Yeah? We are talking about huge things. And I'll come back to an example in a moment. Okay? So I'm just going to show you these slides because to go into details but they all basically reinforce my point. Okay? And who are the companies who gets all the compensation? Almost 3/4 are going to very big companies. We are talking about super big companies. Okay? We're talking about Fortune 500 type companies. Okay? Almost 3/4. Okay? The rest you can hardly even see, some of you. Okay? So these are the likely beneficiaries. Okay? Okay? Okay. So I think you have a sense that this is a very recent invention, a recent creation. It has grown exponentially, it is very lucrative, and it basically enhances the interest and the power of a few large corporations, okay, in the world. Okay, and this is basically what we are signing on to. Of course, I don't think any of you know this, unless you have been following this issue very closely, because none of this is in the public sphere. So we are all signing on to something which we are largely uninformed about. Okay? Okay. This is basically what... So let me give you a hypothetical example. Okay? And the hypothetical example is the following. You have a company which, Malaysia is still a very agricultural country. Okay? Maybe not many Malaysians work in agriculture, but it's still a very agricultural country. And almost all the agriculture uses herbicides. And the single most popular herbicide in this country, which will remain unnamed. I got away with 250 million once, but I don't want to push my luck too much. The single most popular herbicide is produced by one of the most powerful agrochemical companies in the world. Okay? And that company, if the Malaysian Minister of Health or some other part of the government chooses to ban that herbicide, that company can sue the Malaysian government for compensation for lost profits. The fact of Malaysian public interest or public health does not matter. That is not a defense. Okay? Many of you know the case which was recently settled in Australia, and that's why tobacco was carved out of the TPP, because the Australians said, we will not accept this. But none of these issues were ever discussed as far as other things are concerned. So the fact that this is in the interest of Malaysian public health or agricultural workers or whatever does not matter. The fact of the matter is that if you ban something like that, a substance which is known to be toxic, the WHO has declared this particular product to be carcinogenic. It's not just toxic, it's carcinogenic as well. Years ago. Yet nothing has been done. So you can imagine what the implications are. So what will Malaysian government end up with? On the one hand, you have to deal with all the victims, and then you have to deal with a very difficult decision of whether to ban a poison or to allow it to continue. And not to ban it means that if to ban it means that you have to compensate the companies. Not to ban it basically means you allow those chemicals to kill your own citizens. That's the kind of choice. It's a very cruel choice, but this is basically what it involves. So I think we have to deal with the realization that the fact that something is good for our health, for our safety, for our environment, even for all this can be subject to suits. Okay? So you will find that the kinds of issues include wage legislation. Malaysia has a minimum wage. They can sue for that. They can sue for, Wan Saiful has pointed out that affirmative action has been taken out of it. Environmental impact assessment. If you do a serious environmental impact assessment, they can sue for that. They can sue over debt issues and so on and so forth. And the damages will not just be for the recovery of the investments which have been made by the corporations, but also for loss of expected profits. Okay? And this will be a tremendous incentive to sue. Okay? You know, basically you pay a few lawyers and take your chances. Why not? It's like a lottery. You know, it is a lottery when you have that kind of a corrupt system of arbitration. So it is very important, I think, for us to remember that much, much more is at stake. It is not a free trade agreement. In fact, I've tried to make the point that it is, and it is almost irrelevant in terms of promoting trade. And I think it's also important for us to recognize that it will have a chilling effect on regulation. So while many of you are involved with NGOs and others trying to improve the human condition, trying to improve situation in Malaysia, you will be up against not just the usual obstacles and barriers, you will also be up against powerful corporate interests who will basically want to preserve the status quo rather than try to enhance the conditions which you're trying to affect. It will have what the New Zealanders call a chilling effect. And this, basically, it will introduce what is called regulatory chill. So all this will have very, very important implications. And I've already given you the example of the carcinogenic herbicide, so I won't give. Now, remember also that so far, the US has never lost a suit. And there's a Professor Lisa Johnson at the Columbia Law School, and she basically says, publicly, she has said in February, she said, basically we have a situation where it is in the interest of the ISDS arbitration community not to make any decisions against the US government, because the US government is the government which has been broadening the scope for ISDS. So don't bite the hand which is feeding it. But now you have a situation which is going to be very tricky. President Obama has cancelled the pipeline from the Canadian tar sands to Louisiana, and that Trans-Canada is going to sue the US government, and this will be a very, very important test case. In her own studies, she has found that even the US government representatives, the lawyers for the US government, are surprised that they have been so successful, because they thought their case, no chance, but it has been in the interest of the arbitration community to find in their favor. So it is, as I said, essentially a very corrupt thing. Now, many of you might say, foreign interests can be legitimate also. They might have legitimate grounds for complaint. And there are enough safeguards right now. There's something called investor protection, which the World Bank makes available, and now there are even private companies which make available investment protection and so on and so forth. So there are more than adequate remedies which already exist. There is no need whatsoever for ISDS. So why are we doing all this? And I would put it to you that perhaps there are political considerations. As President Obama said in January at his State of the Union message, he said, now with TPP, China no longer does not make the rules in the region, we do. Okay? Now, I would remind you that Vietnam has very legitimate grouses. Vietnam is understandably quite unhappy with China. Almost all the river systems which come into Vietnam start in the Himalayas and come through China before they reach Vietnam. And China has been damming it up, and there are a lot of other problems, bilateral problems Vietnam has with China. The war between Vietnam and the US ended only 41 years ago, and there are a lot of other barriers which they have. And so Vietnam probably will gain a lot from the TPP. They will also lose a lot, like many of us, but they probably do benefit quite a bit. But for the rest of us, I would put it to you that actually the case which has been presented to us is partly false. Okay, it's not completely false, because there are some elements which are true, but the major arguments are actually not either false or misrepresented. So it is true that there will be some increase in trade. It's undoubtedly true, but don't forget that there will be not only increase in exports, there will also be an increase in imports. And let's face it, nobody wants to pick a fight with the US in a present situation. It's still a unipolar world situation, so nobody is going to pick a fight with the US. But at the same time, we are abandoning many principles which have been very important for the country for the last 40 years. Since the time of Tun Razak, the country and ASEAN has been committed to ZOPFAN, the Zone of Peace, Freedom and Neutrality. Tun reminded me of his former classmate, the diplomat Tan Sri Razali, who received an honorary doctorate from USM some years ago, and he talked about this. So many of these principles are now being thrown out, and I think it is important for us to begin to think about the implications of all this. So I would put it to you that we really need to think through what all this implies, and I would say that it is not the gold standard trade agreement which it has been sold as. It is not the agreement for the 21st century, and it is, and I think the big problem for those of you who may be in the arbitration business of this type is that there is so much in the agreement which is ambiguous. Okay, that is the only thing which is unambiguous about is that there's so much ambiguity, and this will give rise to a lot of uncertainty and so many possibilities for suits and so on. So it will actually result in much more litigation, and it will enrich a lot of lawyers, but it will do very little to enhance our collective well-being and so on. So basically, unless the TPP is going to be renegotiated, which is very doubtful in the present situation, I'm afraid we have to be very beware in order to ensure that our legitimate interests and the public interests as well as the national interests are protected. Thank you very much for your attention.